Return to John Lyndon, Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks, François.
Before we talk about the latest, have you been able to piece together exactly what sparked all this?
Well, in the immediate, it seems to be fairly heavy-handed tactics from the Israeli police late at night last night to remove a group of mostly young men, but some women and older people too, from inside the Al-Aqsa mosque. They had barricaded themselves inside with some fireworks and rocks, and the worry seemed to have been that they were going to stay overnight and potentially pose a threat to Jewish visitors to Al-Aqsa, or to the compound rather, today as Passover comes in.
The Prime Minister saying Israel is working to calm tensions. All those who were detained have now been released. Your thoughts on that, on the way the Benjamin Netanyahu is handling it?
I mean, I'd broaden it to just further than just Benjamin Netanyahu, but I think 350 people who are barred from going back up to the Temple Mount, or the sort of the Dome of the Rock site for the duration of Ramadan, is a preventative security measure to try and maintain calm for the rest of this Ramadan period. And I think it shows how frightened the government potentially are about further escalation, but also the danger of this confluence of both Jewish and Muslim holidays this week. I think it just shows how the current status quo on the Temple Mount, as a metaphor for the wider conflict, is incredibly unstable, and this new government contains elements who wish to try and pour fuel on the flames, and I think have an interest in further escalation for their own narrow political reasons.
Well, let's talk about that. The police detaining a number of people this Wednesday near Temple Mount with lambs or goats. They were suspected of intending to sacrifice them for Passover. Apparently, fringe elements do this every year, but are we right to pay attention to it?
Yeah, fringe elements try and do it every single year. The police have apprehended people with goats. It sort of seems slightly absurd from an aesthetic perspective, but it is incredibly dangerous because there's conspiracy theories around further plans for what these sort of Temple Mount activists want to do around this incredibly sensitive site. And again, there are people now inside the government, particularly Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister, who are acolytes and supporters of this movement. So the actual arrests themselves, it's good that the police managed to prevent, as they do every year, any actual sacrifice from taking place. But it's worthwhile imagining what would happen if one person managed to slip by the cordon and a sacrifice took place, what that would then spark off. And we're seeing here the relationship again, just like the war in May 2021, between events very sudden on the Temple Mount, and then an exchange of fire between Gaza and Israel, and then an escalation which is very easy to predict that results in all-out war.
Ben-Gvir himself, how's he playing this?
I mean, he came out and issued a statement earlier today, essentially criticizing the response to the rocket fire, accusing the Israeli Air Force of firing at sand dunes and saying that heads need to roll in Gaza. So calling for a security cabinet meeting for a more escalatory response to these rockets. And I think he is probably making a calculation that he has political gain to be made by siding with those looking for a more firm response. And again, we know in the war in May 2021, before he was a minister, he played a live day-to-day role in escalating the situation in Jerusalem by visiting Sheikh Jarrah and creating tensions between Jewish and Palestinian inhabitants, but also going then to some of the mixed cities. And the police chief at the time accused him of being responsible for what he called an intifada.
And he has recently gotten what he wanted, what with the National Guard being now under his remit. How much power does he wield?
He wields an extraordinary amount of power when you compare where he's come from, which was kind of a sort of rabble-rouser on the streets, to then a backbench MK. There are layers of authority between him and the direct command and control of the police. But he's in charge as the minister of the current sort of security services internally inside Israel. The worry with this new National Guard that you mentioned is that it will be under his direct command. Now, it hasn't yet been set up, but the cabinet vote to create it passed. And the worry is that he will be escalating preparations to create this force under his direct authority. And he's already said very clearly that he wants to use it very narrowly against Arab and Palestinian crime, as he would describe it.
And we've seen in the last minutes, one of the international reactions coming in, that of Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying he's extremely concerned with inflamed rhetoric coming out of Israel, saying we need to see the Israeli government shift its approach. We're hearing that kind of stronger language that we didn't hear before as much.
Yes, I think you're seeing international reaction to this government very different to the last one. I think there was an interest by many in the wider international community to maintain a very fragile, more moderate government for the interest of stability. It's been very clear after 3-4 months of this new incoming government that it is a force for instability. And the interest of most international actors here is simply stability. Nobody has incredibly ambitious ideas for transformative conflict resolution, more to the pity, in my view. But to keep things stable, the worry is that this Israeli government is not an asset and that it has elements within it who are invested in destabilizing the situation. And I expect there to be more strong statements, not just from people like Prime Minister Trudeau, but from the Arab states too. A meeting has been called for the Arab League today, an emergency meeting by Egypt and Jordan. And we now have the uncomfortable position of some of Israel's new normalized partners in the region who have to sit in this meeting and answer to it.
And we heard just a short while ago the head of the United Arab Emirates strongly condemning what's going on. And this just a day after he spoke on the telephone with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Can, in a parallel universe, the Abraham Accords proceed, that strengthening of ties between Israel and Gulf states while all this is going on?
I mean, potentially. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult for the ties to strengthen while this is going on. But one thing that may be possible is to test the hypothesis of whether the Abraham Accords can be really levered towards progress on the Palestinian issue and stabilization. We have over a half century of evidence of anti-normalization, where most of the region did not recognize Israel, did not deal with it. And it's fair to say that it didn't deliver an awful lot of gains for the Palestinians. Now, we have these new kind of newly minted accords between these important Gulf states and Israel. And suddenly there's leverage. There's things these countries can or cannot do for Israel to respond to its behavior and its policies, particularly in religiously sensitive places like the Temple Mount. And I'd love to see, kind of interesting entrepreneurial approaches from these Gulf states about how they can leverage that new relationship.
So better to be in than out, is what you're saying.
I mean, my view personally is that engaging is always better, and that the sort of disengagement hasn't really done an awful lot for the Palestinians. But it's yet to be seen what can actually be achieved. I was in Abu Dhabi when Israel announced an unprecedented new wave of settlement construction and legalization of outposts. And people there were genuinely very angry and disappointed. And very soon afterwards, there was a UN Security Council resolution that was presented by the United Arab Emirates as the Arab country on the council. And it showed that they feel that they have to act as the representative in the council. And one thing we would love to see is those countries saying, what can we do to invest in forces in the region that are working for peace, equality and justice? I mean, imagine scaling the work of peace-building organizations, projects that are really shaping Israeli-Palestinian equality and partnership. It would be an interesting thing for those countries to do because it would be hard for Israelis or Palestinians to oppose.
But on the other hand, when you see these unprecedented protests against the judicial overhaul by this very right-wing government in Israel, cynics argue that if push comes to shove, a little war with Gaza will help Netanyahu. Is that the cynical calculation you see?
Yeah, I mean, a cynic could certainly see that rationale. A war with Gaza, there's a rally around the flag effect every time Israel goes to war. I mean, there is an interesting new dynamic in that people are very suspicious of this government's motivation. So it's yet to be seen whether there will be the same usual very high level of support immediately for any war with the Palestinians, because people can see that some of the people making those decisions now have lost a huge amount of trust with the Israeli people. One other worry is the Iranian sort of file and issue. I do worry that Prime Minister Netanyahu always wants to talk about Iran, and there are some very legitimate and serious issues currently, and I think anything he can do to move that to being the topic of conversation internationally and with his new partners in the Gulf, he would be keen to try and achieve. It's why I think he was in London, Rome, Berlin recently, and I think it's why he wants to go to Washington, D.C. as soon as possible too. One
final question, John Lyndon, you're Irish. Next week, 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, a huge success for the island. At the time, they were just coming after the Oslo Accords. Yep. Did you think we'd be stuck like this today?
It's really interesting because it's the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords this year too, and you can see next to each other two very different exercises in conflict resolution. One not perfect, but so much more successful than the other. And I think the real lesson to learn from them is deep engagement from the United States and the international community, but also this long-term civil society-centered approach where they invested in scale in these movements that brought Catholics and Protestants together in Northern Ireland. I was there recently and the politics are broken. There hasn't been an executive for a while, but society is so strong. Politicians are pretty unimpressive, largely speaking, but these civil society organizations, these local movements, these cross-community groups, they're the real backbone holding everything together, and what we would give to have something like that in Israel-Palestine. And if we had done things differently 30 years ago, maybe we would, and we wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Invest in people, not politicians. Many thanks for that, John Lyndon.